I ended up just spending so much time with such a crazy mixture of people, from a transgendered crack dealer in Brooklyn who ended up actually being one of the smartest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, who's definitely not one of the smartest people I know. And I learned loads of things, but I guess the heart of what I learned is just so much of what we've been told about this for so long. It's now 100 years since we started fighting the war on drugs in this country, and it was then imposed on the rest of the world. So much of what we're told is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Addiction isn't what we think it is. The war on drugs isn't what we think it is. And the alternatives to the war on drugs aren't what we think they are. So in some ways, it's kind of daunting to go all over the world and realize so much of what we take for granted isn't right, but that opens up this whole exciting other set of possibilities.
The main reason why people assume that people do drugs is to escape reality. What do you think is the primary thing that they're running from?
So you've got to separate out two things. And this surprised me because my family's experience was pretty bad and catastrophic addiction. But most drug use, even the main drug war body in the world, the UN Office of Drug Control, admits that 90% of all currently banned drug use is what they call non-problematic. So the person isn't addicted and it doesn't damage their health, right? So 90%. So let's set that aside. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
There's like 90% that's recreational use, where people use because it makes their lives better.
Right.
Then you've got the
like coffee, sip of wine at work, or dinner,
ecstasy, or a whole range of currently cannabis, a whole range of currently illegal drugs. In most cases, there are some people who have addictions to cannabis. But you then got to ask, well, what's happening with this 10% who have got a problem, right? What's going on? And one of the things that really blew my mind in the research for Chasing the Scream was realizing I had deeply misunderstood what addiction is. I had misunderstood the thing I thought I had been seeing in front of me since I was a kid, right? So most people, let's think about heroin addiction because that was close to me. Most people, if we stop the next 20 people to walk past your studio and we said to them, what causes heroin addiction? I think they'd look at us like we were stupid and they'd say, well, the clue's in the name, dipshit, right? Heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years. It's become totally part of our common sense, right? We think if we took the next 20 people after that who walked past the studio and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically need. And we think that, a lot of people think that's what addiction is, right? It's this physical hunger for the chemical hook inside the drug, right? There is some reality to chemical hooks. They exist, they're real, but that's actually a very small part of what's going on. The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something wrong with that story we've been told is when it was explained to me by loads of doctors in Britain, where I'm from. If you step out into the street and you get hit by a truck and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given loads of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's the medical name for heroin. It's the stuff you'll be given in hospital is much better than the shit you buy on the street because it's medically pure. It's not contaminated. If what we think about addiction is right, that it's just caused by exposure to the drug, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are being given loads of heroin, right? Anyone watching this podcast who's got a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken a shit ton of heroin, right? If what we think is right, that addiction is caused primarily by exposure to the chemical hooks, loads of these people should be leaving hospital and trying to score on the streets, right? This has been studied very carefully. It virtually never happens, right? And when I learned that, it just seemed so weird to me. I thought it couldn't possibly be true, right? How could it be you've got someone in a hospital bed who's taking loads of really potent heroin, they don't become addicted, and in the alleyway outside, you've got someone who's using actually a weaker form of the drug who becomes addicted? How can that be? What's happening here? And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and met this amazing man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's really transformed how we think about addiction all over the world. It's led to a new way of thinking and loads of new evidence. So Professor Alexander explained to me, this story that we've been told, right, that addiction is caused by the chemical hooks, primarily, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers can try them at home if they're feeling a little bit shitty today, right? You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. You might remember in the 1980s, there's a famous Partnership for Drug-Free America ad that shows this experiment, right? And the rat in this cage starts to drink always prefers the heroin water, and almost always kills itself within a week or two, right? So there you go. That's our story. You're exposed to the drug, it takes you over, and then you just die, right? But in the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and says he was working with people with addiction problems. And he's like, well, hang on a minute. We put these rats alone in an empty cage. They've got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats, right? What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They got loads of friends, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of coloured balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat finds meaningful in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water, and of course they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the water very much. None of them ever use it compulsively.
The heroin water.
Yeah, the heroin water. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and death by overdose when their lives are shitty to none when they have the things that make life meaningful. And there's loads of human examples I'm sure we'll talk about. But the main thing I took from this is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. We have to ask ourselves, what are the contexts in which people become addicted? Because there are some contexts where people find these drugs extremely addictive, and there are some contexts where they don't become addicted at all. There's something, the drug plays a role. Chemical hooks are real. I can talk about how we know that. They play some role, but they're actually a surprisingly small role of small amount of what's going on. We know this from, there's so many examples.